The sea was calm that night, but the silence it carried was not peace, it was omen. A barge floated gently on the Gulf of Baiae, its sails trimmed and luxurious, a floating palace meant to honor Rome's most feared woman, Agrippina the Younger. Draped in silk and gold, she sat beneath a canopy of stars, unaware that the vessel she boarded was built not for travel, but for murder. Suddenly, the ceiling above her collapsed, the result of a hidden mechanism engineered by Rome's finest artisans. But Agrippina, ever alert, shifted instinctively. The falling lead plates crushed her companion instead. Wounded but alive, Agrippina threw herself into the dark waters, swimming toward the distant shore. She survived. The assassination had failed. The poison had failed. The collapsing ceiling had failed. The shipwreck had failed. And now, the son, the emperor, would have to finish what his cowardice had begun. This was Nero. Rome's golden boy. Adopted by the Emperor Claudius, adorned with poets and philosophers, crowned before he turned 17. A child of dynastic legacy and imperial rot. And yet, as the story of Agrippina's failed murder spread across the empire, the people whispered not of treason, but of something worse. Matricide. In the Roman world, few crimes rivaled it. The bond between mother and son was seen as sacred, even in a culture where emperors murdered brothers and uncles to secure power. But this act, violated the core of Roman pietas, the moral duty to family, state, and gods. Agrippina had raised Nero with fire and ambition. From the moment she married her uncle Claudius, she played the Game of Thrones with chilling precision. She poisoned Claudius to elevate Nero. She exiled rivals. She arranged marriages. She ruled through her son, until he grew tired of her gaze. The Roman court was a theater of terror. Behind velvet drapes and marble statues, conspiracies festered like open wounds. Nero, once a trembling boy reciting verses from Seneca, now surrounded himself with flatterers and whores, dancers and demons. He longed to be an artist, a singer, a god on stage. But his mother remained, stern, ambitious, unmoved. And so, he chose to erase her. This was no sudden madness. Nero had plotted her death for years. First, by trying to isolate her politically. Then, by cutting her allowance. Then came the poison, 3 attempts, all foiled by her suspicious nature and use of antidotes. He tried rigging her bedroom ceiling. He sent assassins. He even explored using a collapsible boat, one that would sink in calm water, disguising her murder as an accident. All failed, until he abandoned illusion. According to Tacitus, on the emperor's final command, an officer was dispatched to her villa with a sword. When the guards broke into her chamber, Agrippina is said to have bared her chest and whispered, "Strike the womb that bore him." The blade fell. Blood stained the mosaic floor. And for the first time in Roman imperial history, a mother died at the hand of her imperial son. But Nero gained no peace. Not in the Senate. Not in the temples. Not even in his dreams. Soon after Agrippina's murder, Nero wandered the palace halls in despair. He confessed to nightmares, seeing her ghost rise from the Tiber, her face half-rotted, her voice whispering betrayal. He sought sorcerers and animal sacrifices to cleanse his guilt. But Rome knew. Rome always knew. The city that once cheered his golden youth now watched with suspicion. They remembered the nobility of Germanicus, Agrippina's father. The martyrdom of her mother and brothers under Tiberius. The tragic ambition that carried her bloodline through flames and poison. And now, her son, her heir, had become her executioner. The horror of it reached beyond Rome's borders. In Egypt, they carved messages into temple walls. In Greece, poets altered their verses. In Parthia, emissaries laughed in disbelief, "So mighty is Caesar that not even his mother may live." What had begun as a dynastic struggle had become a cosmic rupture. Matricide, in Roman belief, defiled not just the family, but the order of the world. The gods themselves were said to turn their gaze from such sin. Lightning struck the capital weeks after her death. A comet passed over the Palatine. The people murmured of divine punishment, not just for Nero, but for all who followed him. But how did it come to this? How did an empire, famed for law and reason, allow a child to become a tyrant, a prince to become a god, a son to become a butcher? Rome was not merely an empire of marble and legions. It was an empire of illusions, one gilded in the names of honor, tradition, and law, yet sustained by blood. And within that facade, the murder of Agrippina was not a rupture. It was a revelation. Matricide, unthinkable to the plebeian mind, became permissible when the regime demanded obedience over nature, power over piety. At the core of this was the imperial cult, the machinery that turned emperors into gods. Since the days of Augustus, emperors were no longer merely rulers, they were divine reflections, manifestations of order, the living axis between man and the heavens. When Nero came to power, the machinery was already in place. Senators bowed like priests. Poets bent their verses. And the common people, starved for spectacle, turned loyalty into worship. But what did loyalty mean in a world where bloodline ruled over merit, and cruelty was the price of continuity? Agrippina herself had played this game. She had mastered its rules. She was born to a dynasty built on betrayal. Her father, Germanicus, had been loved by the army and the people alike, but he died in Syria under mysterious conditions. Her mother was exiled. Her brothers were executed or driven to suicide by Emperor Tiberius. She learned early that in Rome, family was both weapon and wound. And so, when she returned from exile, she used what power Rome afforded a noblewoman, her name, her beauty, her lineage, to stake her claim. She married her uncle Claudius, bore his heir, and positioned herself as the empress mother of destiny. But Rome's patriarchy, though masked in the rhetoric of virtue, feared a woman who ruled without shame. To the Senate, she was domineering. To the historians, mostly men, she was the new Medea, the scheming Jezebel of the Roman stage. And yet, behind the slander was a deeper truth: Agrippina was never more ruthless than the men she opposed. She simply wielded ambition with a woman's body, and that frightened them more than any legion. The regime that raised Nero also raised her. The philosopher Seneca, often romanticized as Nero's moral guide, was no innocent. He penned flattering speeches for Nero and remained silent as his students slipped into madness. Burrus, the Praetorian commander, enforced the emperor's whims so long as his position remained secure. The Senate, long hollowed by years of imperial purges, clapped and praised, even when they smelled blood in the air. Rome had become a theater of obedience. Silence was survival. Praise was policy. In such a system, Agrippina's crime was not power, it was permanence. She remained visible when she should have disappeared. She continued to influence after Nero's ascension. She reminded the emperor, and the court, that he owed his crown not to divine right, but to her. And so, the machine turned against her. The political theater that justified her death was built piece by piece. Nero leaked stories of her conspiracies. He spread rumors of incest, portraying himself as the victim of a mother's unnatural love. He claimed she sought to control him, to seduce him, to rule behind the curtain. And the people, fed by fear, titillation, and superstition, began to believe. Even the assassination was staged to appear accidental. The collapsing ship, the staged wreck, the plausible deniability, all tools of a state more concerned with image than justice. But when that failed, and she was murdered outright, Rome still did not revolt. The Senate praised her death. Coins were struck. Statues were melted. Temples that once bore her name were rededicated. This was how the regime sustained itself, not by righteousness, but by ritual cleansing. Erasure. Rewrite. Burn the name. Recast the memory. The ideology behind this was older than Nero. It was baked into the bones of Roman civilization, that the family existed for the glory of the state, that the individual must bow to destiny, and that order was more sacred than love. By these measures, Agrippina's death was not a crime. It was a sacrifice. Rome always demanded sacrifices. The empire needed Nero, or so it told itself. He brought games, gold, bread, music. He performed in the theater and waved to the crowds. He built lavish palaces and promised a golden age. And for a time, that illusion held. But beneath the applause, Rome trembled. Whispers grew darker. Senators vanished. Poison returned to the court. Nero began executing those who knew the truth of his mother's death, those who remembered her voice, her will, her prophecy. Even Seneca, his former tutor, was later forced to die by his own hand. A society that allows a son to kill his mother and still calls him a god is not a society governed by law. It is a society enslaved by fear. By killing Agrippina, Nero had removed the one soul who could look him in the eye and remind him of what he owed. What remained was only sycophants and statues, voices that praised, never questioned. But truth cannot be buried forever. Beneath the marble of Rome, a stain had spread, not of blood, but of conscience. It would resurface in whispers, in rebellion, in fire. Agrippina had died. But her shadow, and the empire that murdered her, would one day face judgment. Agrippina, daughter of Germanicus, granddaughter of Augustus, mother of Nero, she knew the moment had come. Not because of letters or decrees. Not even because of the whispers from her dwindling circle of allies. But because her son had stopped pretending. Gone were the pleasantries. Gone was the game of veiled threats. What remained was silence, that Roman silence that always came before blood was spilled. The first attempt on her life was a theater of irony, a collapsing boat. Nero, hungry to disguise matricide beneath the folds of fate, arranged for a gift, a beautifully crafted vessel, rigged with a mechanism designed to break apart at sea. It was to be swift, spectacular, and deniable. She was to drown in the moonlit waters of the Gulf of Baiae, and the emperor would mourn her publicly with crocodile tears. But Agrippina survived. She swam through the darkness, her robes heavy with seawater, her limbs scraped and bloodied. Witnesses watched her emerge from the waves, like a specter reborn. Rome itself seemed to shudder, as if the old gods had interfered. That survival was not a reprieve. It was a provocation. Nero panicked. The illusion had failed. Now, there was no room for subtlety. He sent assassins. Under cover of night, they broke into her villa at Misenum. She was alone, stripped of guards, allies, and favor. But when the steel was drawn, she did not cower. Historical accounts, especially from Tacitus, describe her final words with eerie precision. As the first blade was raised, she exposed her belly and commanded, "Strike the womb that bore him." No plea. No scream. Only defiance. That moment, brutal, intimate, almost ceremonial, was the culmination of a life forged in power and finished in betrayal. Agrippina's murder was not the quiet removal of a political rival. It was a son's declaration that empire mattered more than blood. The aftermath was grotesque. Nero, upon hearing of her death, reportedly could not eat, could not sleep. He wandered the halls of his palace, haunted by her ghost. He ordered public celebrations, torchlit processions, proclamations of safety restored, but the wine turned sour in his mouth. He had killed his maker. There were no imperial funerals, no state honors. Her body was burned hastily on a makeshift pyre. No mausoleum bore her name. No poets immortalized her deeds. But Agrippina was no ordinary corpse. Her death became legend, a specter that haunted Nero's reign. The people remembered her eyes, sharp, unblinking. Her ambition. Her voice, which once echoed in Senate halls and palace chambers. She had walked the narrow bridge between mother and sovereign, and for that, she paid in blood. What made the tragedy unbearable was its inevitability. Rome had long been a crucible where family and politics could not coexist. Julia the Elder, banished. Drusus poisoned. Caligula assassinated. Claudius manipulated and murdered. Now Agrippina joined the list, not as a footnote, but as a centerpiece. Her death signaled more than one life extinguished. It marked a passage, the irreversible descent of Nero into madness. He no longer governed with even a pretense of virtue. After Agrippina, his executions grew more erratic. Senators, philosophers, even his wife, all fell. The empire became a stage for a deranged actor playing the role of god and tyrant. The man who murdered his mother could no longer be trusted with peace. Agrippina's death, however, transcended Nero's court. It entered the realm of symbol, the tragedy of Rome itself. A mother who built an emperor, only to be destroyed by the very crown she forged. Her womb had birthed Caesar, and it became her tomb. Later historians, even those who despised her ambition, could not look away from the drama of her fall. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, they all recorded it, each in tones of awe, disgust, and reluctant admiration. They saw in her not just a woman, but an archetype, the empress consumed by the fire she kindled. Her portrait survives on coins, worn and half-erased, a profile in bronze, the curve of her brow, the stern line of her mouth. But even in metal, her image bears tension, power and peril, nobility and vengeance. And though Rome tried to erase her, to strike her name from temples, melt her statues, drown her memory in propaganda, she remained. Because the story of Agrippina is not just about a death. It is about the cost of ambition in a world where power is inherited, not earned. Where women must fight twice as hard to be feared, and die twice as cruelly for being remembered. It is about the empire that taught its sons to kill, and its mothers to accept the knife with pride. And it is about a final, immortal cry echoing through the marbled halls of history. Strike the womb that bore him. Long after the flames of Agrippina's funeral pyre cooled, her presence endured, not in marble or law, but in fear. Nero, despite all his grandeur, became a haunted man. He saw her in dreams. In corridors. In the eyes of senators who dared to meet his gaze. She was not merely a ghost, she was judgment incarnate. The embodiment of the empire's conscience, carved into the bones of every crime that followed. This haunting was not metaphysical alone. It was political. The death of Agrippina had torn away the veil from Nero's regime. The people of Rome, who once sang of divine lineage and imperial mother-son piety, now whispered of blood. Superstition thrived. The city, already trembling under the weight of conspiracies and fires, began to murmur of divine wrath. Poets lost their tongues. Philosophers disappeared. Even the circus, Rome's great arena of distraction, could not silence the gossip. The emperor killed his mother, they said in markets, in villas, in brothels and temples. What followed was not merely tyranny. It was paranoia turned ritual. Nero established a culture of denunciation. Informants were rewarded. Families were torn apart by suspicion. A senator might speak too fondly of the old Claudian bloodline, gone. A scholar might reference Augustus with too much reverence, exiled. Every act of affection for the past became a nail in one's coffin. And always, Agrippina's shadow lingered. Artists, bound by imperial decree, were forbidden to paint her image. Her busts were shattered, melted into coins bearing Nero's triumphant face. But Rome is a city of layers. Beneath the newer temples, hidden behind crumbling murals, her face survived, etched in secrecy, remembered in whispers. Agrippina became a martyr, not of religion, but of memory. Her murder set a precedent that could not be undone. If the emperor could kill his mother and remain emperor, then what, truly, was sacred? A threshold had been crossed. Future emperors would learn from Nero's example, but also fear it. Domitian, Caracalla, even Commodus, each in their own ways would become heirs not to Augustus, but to Agrippina's corpse. The empire, once cloaked in the rhetoric of civilization and virtue, had revealed its core, a throne secured by terror, not trust. Even centuries later, when the Roman Empire had long since fractured into dust and legend, historians and theologians debated her story. Was she too ambitious? Did she provoke her fate? Or was she a mother betrayed by the very system that had promised her glory? Agrippina's legacy, like that of Rome itself, was contradictory. To some, she was a manipulator, the true power behind Claudius, the architect of Nero's rise. To others, she was a woman who dared to exist as a force in a world that demanded silence from her kind. Either way, she did not go quietly. She was the scream behind Nero's laughter. The figure looming behind every imperial decree. The woman who proved that even in an empire of men, a mother's shadow could stretch further than a sword. Some claimed she cursed Nero, that his eventual suicide, in a dirty villa far from Rome, was her final revenge. That his last words, "What an artist dies in me," were less about grief and more about guilt. That in the moment before death, it was not the Senate, nor the people, nor the gods that came to him, but her. The woman he could never bury deep enough. Perhaps that is why, when modern archaeologists brush away centuries of dust and find her face carved into coins, or when historians revisit the blood-stained chapters of Nero's reign, they do not speak of her as merely a victim. They speak of her as Rome itself, beautiful and brutal, nurturing and merciless, mother and executioner. Her legacy is not only in the fire that consumed her corpse, but in the torch she lit, burning through time, illuminating every tyrant who dared forget the cost of betrayal. Because some ghosts are not meant to be banished. Some are carved into the stone. And some, like Agrippina, remain forever seated at the edge of the throne. The crime of Nero did not die with him. It echoed, not only through the crumbling halls of palaces, but in the very architecture of power. The memory of his mother's death was etched into the veins of empire like a dark pulse, an unspoken rule that every ruler afterward could feel beneath their skin. The crime was not just that a mother was murdered. It was that the sanctity of motherhood itself, an almost sacred pillar of Roman identity, was shattered. To the Romans, Mater Familias was more than domestic figure. She was protector of bloodline, symbol of continuity, the quiet stabilizer beneath the chaos of politics. When Agrippina's blood seeped into the sea, it was not only a woman's life that ended. It was the moral contract between ruler and kin, between man and the divine order of Rome. And yet, the world moved on. The Senate continued to meet. Gladiators bled for sport. New laws were written. New temples built. But deep down, there was rot. Nero had opened a wound in the Roman psyche that could not be cauterized. He had shown that power no longer needed legitimacy, it only required survival. His successors learned the lesson. Domitian would be stabbed in the gut by his own household. Commodus would die in a bathhouse, strangled by a wrestler. Caracalla, stabbed while relieving himself along a lonely road. All victims not merely of plots, but of a sickness that began the day a son killed his mother and still ruled without consequence. Even emperors who ruled well ruled with fear. The cry of Agrippina's death became a silent curse: if you forget the horror, it will become your fate. And still, the world forgot. Centuries passed. The Western Empire fell. Christianity grew from the margins. Nero, once godlike in statuary, was reduced to a madman in sermons and school texts. Agrippina, if remembered at all, became a footnote, a dangerous woman, a schemer, perhaps a villain in velvet robes. But history is a spiral, not a line. The crime returns. Again and again, rulers cast aside family for power. They poison bloodlines. They rewrite truth. They erase portraits, edit legacies, and think the past can be drowned beneath gold and marble. But ghosts do not fade so easily. Agrippina lives in every palace that hides a murder. In every son who betrays the womb that bore him. In every woman cast aside for speaking with strength in a world that punishes ambition in a mother's voice. Her story reminds us that the cost of forgetting is not silence, it is repetition. When power demands the sacrifice of those who made it possible, it is not triumph. It is decay. And when we allow history to reduce Agrippina to myth or manipulation, we ignore the scream beneath every empire, that glory is often built atop betrayal, and that the torch of civilization is often held by hands soaked in kin's blood. In the end, the crime that terrified Rome was not merely that a son murdered his mother. It was that the world accepted it. They watched the funeral pyre burn and sang praises to the emperor. They whispered in shadows but stood silent in daylight. And by the time they dared to speak again, Rome had already begun to crumble. So we ask, what survives? A throne, empty. A name, reviled. A woman, unbowed in death. And a question, echoing forever. What is a mother worth, when power is the only god?